This is the Comics Alternative Manga, reviews of Uncomfortably Happily and Appleseed Alpha. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Manga. I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
And we're two guys with advanced degrees or in the process of getting an advanced degree talking about manga. And on this month's episode, Shea and I are going to be looking at two relatively recent books. We're going to begin with Yeon-Sik Hong's Uncomfortably Happily. And then after that, we're going to look at Appleseed Alpha by Yu Kuroda. But before we get to those titles, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Manga is brought to you by those wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts will be between 20 and 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some incredible specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price, sometimes 50% off of the cover, but every now and again, you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
This month, you can get volumes of Rurouni Kenshin at the Viz Big editions of Rurouni Kenshin for 30% off. And you can get volumes of Akira, which we've talked about on the show, for 25% off.
That's right. You know, you can't go wrong with Discount Comic Book Service and their sister company, In Stock Trade, for all of your comics and manga ordering needs. That's dcbservice.com or instocktrades.com. Go there. Whenever you need comics, they're the place to go. And after you do get your manga there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Shea and Derek sent you. Well, Shea, it's been a while since you and I have done a manga show, and there's kind of a couple of reasons for that. I know on my end, and I've mentioned this on previous episodes recently, you know, I've recently moved to North Carolina to take care of my father, and that has taken a lot out of me to where I couldn't devote the time that I really wanted to with the podcast. So I know on my end, that's one of the reasons why we haven't done the manga monthly show in quite a while. But then you've had some changes in your own life.
Yeah, I have. I've, in the last couple months, I've started a graduate program. I've started in the PhD program at SMU here in Dallas. And so that's been keeping me pretty busy for the last few months. But I've started kind of to find a rhythm, and I've been able to carve out the time to get back to this, which I really missed.
Yeah, I did too. And, you know, it's definitely understandable how your new schedule with grad school, getting into the swing of things, can eat up your time. I mean, it's been a while, but I definitely remember how it was with me in graduate school when I first started going to Purdue. I mean, that really did sap all of my time. But, you're there, you're getting are you starting with first your master's and then going on for the PhD?
No, it's a PhD program. So
so straight through.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I know mine was you get the master's and then you go into the PhD, but yours is just straight to the PhD. So you plug away there, and in the not too distant future, I can introduce us as two guys with PhDs definitely talking about manga. And, you know, we also mentioned a moment ago that we're back with the monthly manga show. We should mention to the listeners that you and I have decided to do not just one, but actually two manga episodes this month. The two books that we're going to be talking about on this episode, Uncomfortably Happily and then Appleseed Alpha, are two works that I think you and I had planned on discussing back in August, but then again, because of what we were going through, we didn't get around to that. So we're going to talk about those on this episode. And then at the tail end of October, you and I are going to do something similar to what we did last year, to pay tribute, so to speak, to the Halloween season. We're going to look at a variety of manga horror titles.
Yeah, in the past when we've talked about horror titles, we've managed to get lucky and get some really good ones. So I kind of leapt at the opportunity when you suggested let's try to do two and make one a themed Halloween episode.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that one. But I'm also looking forward to today's discussion as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, let's go ahead and get into this episode's discussion. And we're going to start with Uncomfortably Happily. This is by the Korean artist Yeon-Sik, and it's published by Drawn Quarterly. It actually came out back in mid-June. But I know this is one that you and I particularly want to discuss because on the Manga Show, and we've been doing this for quite a while now, we've yet to discuss a work of manhwa.
Yeah, this is, I think in some ways it fits very neatly with some of the books we've talked about before, and in other ways it's very new.
Yeah, it is. It maybe start off by talking about Yeon-Sik Hong's style. What do you think of his art style?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because that is one of the things I wanted to touch on. I skimmed a few reviews of this briefly before we started recording, and I saw a lot of comparisons to like Linda Berry, and those comparisons didn't seem right to me. The way Yeon-Sik Hong draws doesn't really strike me as anything similar to the way Linda Berry draws. But it's difficult to describe because there are these moments that are very lush, very accomplished in terms of draftsmanship, very detailed, very busy in terms of the amount of lines on the page. And then there's other panels that are very simple, very cartoonish, very broad, very expressive. So it's difficult to really sum up Yeon-Sik Hong's aesthetic, but I think consistently I saw I likened it to the way like Hergé draws, and specifically the way Scott McCloud talks about the way Hergé draws in I think Understanding Comics, when he talks about Hergé's Linclair style is defined by these very simple, very kind of simplified, abstract, almost minimalist figures in the foreground, and then these very detailed, elaborate, much more naturalistic or realistic backgrounds. And so I think I don't know if it totally works for every panel, but I think that's the way I would describe the way Yeon-Sik Hong draws.
Yeah, I think you've put your finger right on it in everything that you've said. I mean, there are a variety of instances in this book where, not only the protagonist, Hong, and his wife, Somi Lee, are drawn, as well as other characters, right? More simplified, more iconic, and at times more cartoony. But the backgrounds, especially the nature backgrounds, which is important in this book, and we'll get to that in a moment, are much more detailed and I guess realistic looking as opposed to more iconic or cartoony. You also mentioned the, I guess, graphic hyperbole, the extremes, the cartoonish aspect of it. As you were talking a moment ago, I was flipping through, and I ended up on page 327, and there's a scene where Hong is sleeping, and one of his cats, because he and his wife have a number of cats there at their house, comes up to him as he's asleep and starts licking his lips. And then that wakes Hong up, and he violently pushes the cat away and starts spitting. And the look of his face, where he has these two really big lips that are protruding from his face. Again, it's kind of an extreme exaggeration of his feelings at the time. But there are a variety of moments like that where Hong, the artist, and we should make a distinction between Yeon-Sik Hong, the artist, the author, and Yeon-Sik Hong, the character in this book. But there are instances where Hong, the artist, is drawing exaggerated expressions and facial features and sometimes even bodily movements to accentuate what's going on at the moment. And you mentioned Linda Berry, and a few of the reviews mentioned that. I don't see that. I'm kind of like you. I don't see that. It's a very different kind of style. I mean, if anything, maybe the kind of cartoonish looks at times, but in no way whatsoever, as I was reading Uncomfortably Happily, did I think of Linda Berry.
Yeah. I thought more of Brian Lee O'Malley than I would have Linda Berry.
Yes.
Particularly the way I'm thinking of one scene in particular strikes me as particularly Scott Pilgrim-esque in terms of the way it looks. I'm trying to find a page number. It's where they're sitting in front of their house on top of all of the boxes.
When they first move in?
Yeah. Let's see. Okay. It's this large panel at the on page 38. That page struck me as particularly the way Hong and his wife look in that panel is very reminiscent of the way Brian Lee O'Malley draws in like the third or fourth.
36.
Yeah. Oh, mine says 38.
Huh.
Weird.
And you're looking at a PDF, right?
Yeah, but the like pagination is numbered. The pages are numbered.
Huh.
On the page.
In my hard copy, it's 36. That is weird. But yeah, I agree with you in that there is some art in this book that is reminiscent of Brian Lee O'Malley. But it's important to note that Brian Lee O'Malley himself is influenced by manga. So
yeah,
I mean, this is not surprising. One of the things we started off talking about the art style, which I think is good because, as both of us have pointed out, Hong's style is distinctive, and I think, non-Linda Berry-esque. But but let's mention something about what this story is about. Now, this book we've neglected to mention the person who translated it. Helen Jo is the translator of this from the Korean. And this is a book. I don't know if you would call it a memoir, but it's about Yeon-Sik Hong and his wife Somi Lee getting tired of living in Seoul. This takes place soon after Hong and Lee get married, and they're living in an apartment in Seoul. It's crowded. It's noisy. Hong is trying to make ends meet as a freelance artist working on a series. He has problems with his editor, who is obsessive about re-edits and rewrites. And so there are a variety of occasions throughout this narrative where Hong is at odds with his editor. And the way that Hong, the author, represents this, I guess, push and pull between Hong, the character, and his editor is really interesting. It becomes a little fantastical at times, where with, like I say, the editor coming through the telephone and as a little miniature figure and nagging Hong. And I appreciate those moments. But both Hong and his wife Lee decide that they want to move to another apartment outside of Seoul. And so at the beginning of the book, they begin looking at houses in the suburbs of Seoul, but they find out that many of those places are no better, or in many ways no different, than their habitat in Seoul. And so they decide to take this house that is in a mountainous area. And what's the area called? Pocheon?
Yeah, I was trying to recall the name of it.
I think it's Pocheon.
Yes, that sounds correct to me, because throughout the book I had a difficulty recalling precisely what the name of this town was called.
Yeah, and they are living on a mountain, and it is a very rural area. Mm-hmm. And I think they move in, I don't know if it's summer or spring.
I think it's fall.
Is it fall? Because it could be fall, because soon after they move there. Actually, the book begins in late summer, and we should mention that the sections, I don't know if I call them chapters, but the sections of this book are divided by seasons. So we start in the late summer, then we get into the fall, then winter, so on and so forth. And when they first move in, and this is a house, right? It's not an apartment, so they have quite a bit of space, but it's away from everything. And they don't have a car. They don't have any way into the city, Seoul or otherwise, outside of walking and taking the bus, which becomes problematic as the story develops. But it's about what happens in their experience in living in this house on the mountain, and how things evolve, especially in terms of Yeon-Sik Hong, the character, where the first winter especially, he experiences, how should we put this, moments that are akin to what you see in The Shining, let's say.
Yeah.
Where, I mean, he doesn't become murderous, but he starts to go stir crazy. And it is not just stir crazy, but he starts to doubt his own self, his own art, his reasons for doing what he's doing. And he starts to lose it.
How does he describe it later in the book? It's like he's like reflecting on how he was feeling then, and he describes it as like he had taken a poison pill or something like that. I'm trying to find the precise page where he mentions this, but yeah, later he does describe it as like he was dying. It's
okay. Yeah. He does kind of break apart and to some degree disintegrates, not completely, because he's able to pull it together after a while, but not until after going through a very dark period. And, his wife, Lee, is very supportive the entire time. And what this book, Uncomfortably Happily, is all about is, I guess it's more episodic than anything, in that we get to see the moments of their lives in terms of having moved to this very rural, mountainous home, the experiences that they go through in adjusting to this different kind of lifestyle from having lived in Seoul for so many years. And, also we get to see what goes on in their lives, even in a very mundane way. And that's one of the things I really appreciated about Uncomfortably Happy, because it's not just a series of these kind of larger, more grandiose moments, like, for instance, Hong, starting to break down during the winter, right? But we get to see their lives in what they do every day, in terms of, let's say, making sure that the stove that Hong installs is supplied with charcoal, attending to the dog, maybe going for a walk with the dog. They get a dog after a while for safety purposes. And it's these everyday things that they go through: planting a garden, moving stones in order to, create kind of a driveway or a kind of a barrier so people who are tourists on the mountains, won't park in their yard. Little things like that, and how they deal with that, and how they find, in many ways, meaning, purpose, and pleasure in these little everyday things. So I really did enjoy that aspect of this book.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned it. There is a number of scenes that are very quotidian. Much of this book is concerned with minutia and these little, I'm looking at just for this random page on 42, and the 3 panels is just Hong opening the blinds. So much of this book is just like little movements, little motions, little gestures, that are kind of like spread out over 3 or 4 panels or the entire page. And I think those were the moments in the book that I found the most charming and the most kind of compelling, was just kind of watching these figures go about their life with incredible detail, and Hong following himself and his wife, and their kind of goings-ons with this level of precision. I think those were the elements of the book that I responded to most. The kind of broader, or I guess more, I don't know how I would describe the more central component of the thing that really is like autobiography, like what's going on with Hong's job and work and that sort of thing was far less interesting to me than just watching, him garden or whatever. Because as the listeners of this show know, I don't find myself enjoying autobiography very much.
That's interesting. I want to comment on a couple of things that you said, and both spring from your comments on autobiography. I agree with you that it is those parts of the narrative where he's doing the kind of everyday thing, like planting a garden or clearing something or playing with blinds. Those, in many ways, are more telling than the moments where we see him as an artist. Because, in some ways, I guess you could call Uncomfortably Happy a narrative about an artist and what he has to go through. Because, there is quite a bit of time spent on Hong, the character, struggling with his art. He's a procrastinator and he works slow, I guess, as his editor tells him, and his publisher, and his run-ins with both the publisher and especially the editor. So we get a lot of those moments. But like you, I enjoyed and appreciated those quotidian moments, the mendacity, I guess, the everyday, more than those segments where we see him as an artist struggling. The other thing I wanted to comment in terms of your mentioning of this as an autobiography, I'm wondering, do we call this autobiographical in any way? Do we call this something like a memoir? I was going through this, and unless I missed something, the promotional material, at least on the inside flaps, I do not see that Drawn in Quarterly has put in the word memoir or autobiography anywhere in terms of the cover or the artist information, or even in the blurbs on the back. And those are by, three biggies: Seth, John Porcellino, and Leslie Stein wrote endorsements for this book on the back. I don't think the words memoir or autobiography appear. Now, I'm assuming that Yeon-Sik Hong went through something like this, where he and his, at the time, new wife did move to a rural area. But there's nothing, as far as I know, in the paratext, in other words, the promotional material that surrounds this, that I'm aware of, that I guess underscores that this actually did happen to him. It's easy. I guess this is where I'm going with this. It's easy to see this as a work of fiction in terms of the way it's constructed, more than it is to see it as anything like a memoir or autobiography. And for that reason, I think it's very important that we distinguish between Yeon-Sik Hong, the author, and Yeon-Sik Hong, the character. Now, just because an author writes a narrative with a character who bears his or her name doesn't mean that it's autobiography. A great example of this, someone I've done a lot of work on is Philip Roth.
Philip Roth is exactly who I was thinking of as well.
Exactly. There are a number of books where his protagonist is Philip Roth, like Operation Shylock and The Plot Against America. But that stuff didn't happen to him. Even though with Plot Against America, with Operation Shylock, he did claim that it did, but later he recanted. But, and there's no law in any kind of creative writing that says that whenever you have a character that bears your name, it has to be autobiographical. I mean, why not create a fictional narrative with a character who has the same name? Now, I'm not saying that Yeon-Sik Hong did this, but my feeling in reading Uncomfortably Happy is that it felt more like a work of fiction than it did anything autobiographical. What are your thoughts on this?
That's a really good point, because, as you mentioned, and there's nothing explicitly stating that this is a work of memoir or autobiography. There is, that was a conclusion I came to kind of based on my own assumptions, and it was principally because my just general understanding of the work was that it was a work of autobiography, and I that was an assumption I just didn't question. And reading it, it felt very much like a work of autobiography. So you're right in kind of raising that question, because you're absolutely right. I have no idea whether or not this is autobiography. There's nothing explicit stating whether or not it is autobiography. And there's a good argument to be made that it may not be, or maybe partially autobiographical. But But it is interesting that I had a very different reading experience than you, because you said that it struck you as the way it was the composure of it struck you as being fictional or fictitious, or at least that was very easy to see that it might be. Whereas for me, I found it. I never once questioned that it was autobiography. I just assumed and. I had that assumption going into the reading, and then the reading kind of confirmed it for me. I didn't see anything that struck me or made me question that assumption. So it is interesting that we had seem to have very different reading experiences and interpretations of that material.
I agree with you in that because the protagonist, Yeon-Sik Hong, bears the same name as the author, it seems autobiographical. So again, to some degree, I kind of assumed that something like this, maybe not the exact same stuff that happens in the book, but something like this happened to the actual author, the real-life author. But another reason why it seems it had a more fictional feel to me than autobiography, even though I suspected it may have some roots in Hong's life, is that there, unless I'm forgetting something, there's no instance in Uncomfortably Happily where we have a past tense. In other words, we don't have a narrator who in any way whatsoever is telling us that he is looking back on a previous time. Which is what you find mostly in autobiography, where you have a narrator who is telling us about what she or he went through at a particular time. And so there is a more overt sense of the past, right? That this is the present, and in this graphic novel or in this text, I am telling you what happened to me at a previous time in my life. Uncomfortably Happy is, again, from what I can recall, constantly in the present. In other words, the actions that take place from the very first page until the very end, it's as if they're happening at that moment, which is what you usually find in a work of fiction. Now, yeah, there are instances in fictional works, and one that immediately comes to mind is Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, where you have a narrator who overtly tells you that he is looking back on his past life. So, yeah, there are instances of fiction, where there is a more overt past. But the way that the story is told in Uncomfortably Happy in the present tense. So it's for those reasons that I do feel that Uncomfortably Happy has a more fictional tone than autobiographical, again, because it's rooted in the present. So, but it's interesting to hear that when you read this, you were approaching it in a more autobiographical sense.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Invisible Man, actually, because I'm in the middle of reading it. So it's a good one to bring up. But I think you're right that there is the book is told almost entirely in the present tense, except for one exception that really is stuck with me because it's odd. It's the last. Or I guess second to last sentence of the book on the second to last page. It says, in 2017, around the end of the summer, we left the mountain. And that's, I think, the first time in the book that is explicitly in the past tense. But so that it is interesting in the context of this because it does stand out because of that. But I am interested what you, it didn't strike me as odd because I didn't really pick up on the fact that it was until that point present tense, and that might be an indication that it was fiction. So I didn't really clock that that last sentence or so was anomalous and significant because of that. So I am interested what you make of that past tense in the last sentence. Do you think that complicates the use of the present tense in this book, or?
I'm glad you brought that up because I had forgotten that very last, or I guess the penultimate page, and as you read, in 2009, around the end of the summer, we left the mountain. That did strike me at the time. Now that you say this, it did strike me as a little unusual and anomalous. It stuck out, in other words, because it's one of the very few. There may be one or two other instances in this narrative. And by the way, this is a very long book, right? It clocks in at about, 592 pages. So it's a thick one. But there may be one or two other instances where we have a narrator who is telling us something that is, let's say, extra diegetic from the vast majority of the action, almost, the entire book, that takes place with, them making the move, them on the mountain and, getting used to the mountain and all that, and their trials and tribulations. But, it is very different. And I don't see this as a flaw. I don't see it as a flaw. I just see it as something more curious than anything, especially since throughout the vast majority of the book, and again, there may be one or two exceptions. I'd have to go back and reread it just to see if there are those other moments, that are few and far between, where a narrator tells us something that comments on what a character does. It's a little unusual.
Yeah. Yeah, I might have to think about that a little more because now you've got me. Now you have your argument is convincing enough that I'm questioning whether or not I believe this is autobio or fiction, and what do I do with that? So I have to think about that a little bit more.
Yeah, but when it comes right down to it, trying to pigeonhole, so to speak, a text within a particular genre, right? Is it autobiographical? Is it science fiction? Is it fantasy? Is it a crime detective novel? Is it, just kind of general fiction or whatnot? That can be problematic. I mean, there's nothing to say that, Yeon-Sik Hong can't create a narrative that could have elements of both autobiography and fiction, right? But I think as readers, we do tend to think in terms, or at least I do, in terms of categories, right? Is this a work of memoir or autobiography? Is this something that fits within a particular genre? Is this fiction? And I don't feel that we have to necessarily impose our own categorization on these texts. It may be a little unusual to have the vast majority, let's say 99.9% of this narrative in the present tense without a narrator, and then that 0.1% have something in the past tense where you do have a narrator's presence, a non-diegetic narrator coming in and telling us something. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. It may seem a little unusual, but it's the artist's prerogative to do that if he wants.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think there's, I think really for me the interest in kind of discerning whether or not I should read it as autobiography fiction is I agree. Trying to force it into a box, so to speak, does kind of constrain the way that we read it. But I'm certainly guilty of reflexively reading certain texts certain ways if I understand them to be one genre or the other, to fulfill some certain generic trope or subvert it or what have you. So I think, rightly or wrongly, and I think probably wrongly, my impulse is to read things differently that are fiction and versus is nonfiction. So that's where my interest comes from. But you're right. It ultimately has no bearing on the text itself, or it shouldn't, because it really should make no difference whether or not it's fiction or not.
Yeah. But you said something that that really makes a lot of sense, that we come to, we come to a particular kind of writing, excuse me, with certain expectations, especially in the distinction that we usually make between, let's say, autobiographical text or memoirist texts and fiction. Who was it? Was was it Philippe Lejeune who wrote about the autobiographical pact, if I remember correctly. And basically, it's this understanding that when we come to a work of autobiography, we assume certain things, right? That it's rooted in many ways, maybe not in every way, in the author's actual lived experience, right? So this does have some real world roots and consistencies, and that the pact between the author and the reader is that, this is true. This actually did happen to the author. And the author would be breaking that pact if in an autobiography they would all of a sudden start to fictionalize. And I understand that. I understand those expectations. On the other hand, what do you do with an author? And again, Philip Roth is a great example. Who writes what seems to be an autobiography, but is actually nothing but a work of fiction. Is the author breaking that pact? And when you're talking about breaking a pact, there's something negative about that, right? So the author's not doing what the author should be doing. They're not honoring that understanding between author and reader that, this has, links to my real world lived experience for the author. But an author who seems to be writing autobiography, but is nonetheless writing fiction, is doing something different. Actually, what Philip Roth would call being mischievous. And I appreciate that. I mean, I like that mixing up and confusing of the reader and trying to keep the reader on his or her toes, and also give, the reader, scholars, and otherwise something to talk about. But, you are right. We do come to different works with certain expectations, right? I mean, if there's a work of science fiction, we come to it with certain expectations. If there's a work of memoir, we come to it with certain expectations. So, yeah, I mean, we don't read as a blank slate. I mean, we come with baggage.
Yeah. Now, I we talked briefly before we started recording about, these two books, and you had decided that you wanted to talk about Uncomfortably Happily first because it was the book that you felt you had the most to say about, which is interesting because I felt the opposite. I have much more to say about Appleseed Alpha. So I was curious what about the book really resonated with you that made you think that or what about the book do you respond to so strongly, it seems like?
And part of what I've said in the past in terms of the everyday experiences that Hong and his wife Lee go through, even those I really enjoyed, and this is about halfway through the book, I think, the really dark moments, that first winter, maybe not quite halfway through, where Hong is having his Jack Nicholson shining moment and seems to be breaking apart. Again, non-murderous, but he seems to disintegrate and he's at his lowest point. I really enjoyed that section. Other parts of the book or the story that I really enjoyed, and again, this is more episodic than anything. Hong struggles with transportation, his having to walk down the mountain in order to go into Seoul, catch a bus, and it taking him quite a long time in order to get to the city where he could meet with his publisher or even go to school. And in fact, when we first see him in Uncomfortably Happily, he's taken a hiatus from his studies in order to work on a manga that will provide him with enough money so that not only he could provide for his family, but he can go back to school. And so it's his problems with travel. At one point, he gets a motorcycle, and that seems to be the pinnacle of what he wanted. He really enjoys that. Later on, he gets tired of it. They sell it. It's what they go through in terms of winter. I really enjoyed the scenes with the dog. They get, what do they call the dog? I can't remember the dog's name. Oki, that's right, Oki. And, it's a very unusual dog. When they first see Oki, he's in a pen, and the owner who sells him says he doesn't bark. Since I weaned him from his mother, he just doesn't make any sound. He doesn't bark. And he's a very quiet dog. But then once they get him to the mountain and he's out in the open and can run around, he starts barking. And just as both Hong and his wife Lee find a new life there on the mountain, Oki seems to find a new life on the mountain as well. And in fact, he's always wanting to go walkies. He's always wanting to go out and nags his owners until they do take him out. So I enjoyed those moments as well. And also with the other animals, they have a number of cats. Another thing I really liked about this narrative is what they go through in terms of the stove that Hong puts in. And again, these are very mundane moments in their lives, but I think that Yeon-Sik Hong, the author, instills them with enough significance to where I got a lot out of them. I mean, you can find out a lot about the characters through the kind of mundane everything everyday activities that they do. So, those are the kind of things that I really enjoyed about Uncomfortably Happy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I enjoyed a number of those elements as well, particularly the dog. I loved the scenes with the dogs, and especially in the winter, the way he draws the dogs kind of like breath that you can see I found really just enjoyable for whatever reason. But I think this is a book that, like I mentioned, I just have a difficulty getting into autobiographical comics. And I think in this I found a lot of the same problems. And like I mentioned, a number of scenes and pages are really beautiful and really charming, and I really enjoyed quite a bit. But I think on the whole, it just didn't grip me in the way that I think other comics do. Yeah. I had a very similar reaction to other autobio comics or memoir comics or slice of life comics, even ones that I've enjoyed, that like I recognize that there is something here that is interesting, but just for whatever reason it just doesn't resonate with me, and so it leaves me a little cold. I don't think through any fault of the text. I think it's just my personal tastes or whatever. But I am glad that you suggested reading this for the podcast, because I did really enjoy a number of individual scenes. I thought were really, really charming and really, really enjoyable.
Yeah. Another thing I appreciate about Uncomfortably Happily is what Hong, the author, does with a sense of place. I mean, I really did get a full, thick sense of location and setting, and what the characters were going through geographically from reading this graphic novel. I could picture in my mind easily the kind of situation that they were in, being there on the mountain, having to walk into the city. And so I think that Hong's sense of place is very keen in this book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is something I would absolutely agree with, and I think the way he draws nature and the way he draws the area around their house as so finely detailed and just richly drawn, I think adds a lot of it does a lot of that work. It gives you a really strong sense of space and of place and of texture and all that. And so I would absolutely agree that Hong's, the way he kind of composes space and uses space and gives the reader a sense of that location is really, really effective and impressive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I know you didn't like it as much as I did, but I mean, this is a book that I would strongly recommend to our listeners. They should check out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think, I liked it. I don't want to say I didn't like it. I don't think I liked it quite as much as you. Mm-hmm. It just left me kind of, it just left me a bit cold, but I would also recommend it to our readers. I think it is something that if you are interested in these kinds of comics, that it's going to really work well on you.
Yeah. And also, again, as we pointed out at the top of this discussion, this is significant for us in that is the first instance of Korean manga or manhwa that you and I have discussed on the manga series.
Yeah, and I would certainly be open to taking a look at more. So hopefully more gets translated.
Yeah. Well, Shea, let's move on to the second book that we're looking at for this episode. And you mentioned it a moment ago. This is Appleseed Alpha by Io Kuroda. This came out from Kodansha Comics back in early July. Again, this is something that we were going to discuss back in August, but we just couldn't. But we're doing it now. And this is a book that, now, whereas I liked Uncomfortably Happily more than you did, we got the inverse here. You like Appleseed Alpha a lot more than I did.
Yeah, I did. And I think for some of the reasons that I mentioned when we were talking about Uncomfortably Happily, I think for me, a comic that just like resonates with me on an aesthetic level is always going to stick with me much longer. It's going to resonate with me more than I think Uncomfortably Happily, which is produced in a style that I just don't have quite the same affection for. Mm-hmm. Whereas Appleseed Alpha, I think, is inarguably, it's not as, I don't think the story is well told. I don't think the characters are as well developed. I think in terms of narrative, in terms of plot, in terms of story, Uncomfortably Happily is the superior work. It's the richer work. It's the more complex work. But Appleseed Alpha, the way Kuroda draws, and particularly his use of ink, is just, that's like really what I want in a comic, is just this comic to like look good in a certain way. And so for me, I ended up really enjoying Appleseed Alpha, even though I don't think that the narrative really works. Its problems. It doesn't flow very well. I think it is. It's a beautifully, beautifully drawn comic, and sci-fi comics that look the way that Appleseed Alpha looks, which is, for people who aren't familiar with it, looks very similar to like early Paul Pope, like early '90s Paul Pope work.
Yes.
Or like Sloan Leong's work. Just it's very expressive. It's very reliant on inks and very thick brush strokes, very visible brush strokes. It's just this aesthetic that, for whatever reason, is really effective on me. And so I found myself really, really enjoying this book because of, I think exclusively because of the way it is drawn. But yeah, it's and that's part of the problem I have with most autobio comics, is that I recognize that there is a interesting story there, but it's not drawn in a way that really works on me. Whereas a lot of like schlocky, pulpy, not particularly well written sci-fi comics, I am a huge fan of, because they have this look to them that really is effective on me. And I think Appleseed Alpha is one of those.
Yeah, I agree with you in about everything you've said. The story is problematic, and we can talk about that. But I do appreciate Kuroda's art, and you're right. It is very, I guess, heavy in terms of the inks. You have a lot of thick lines. And I'm glad you mentioned comparison with Paul Pope. I hadn't thought about it before, but now that you've said that, it makes sense. The art in Appleseed Alpha does have that early Paul Pope feel to it. And there's something kind of freewheeling about the art style that I appreciate. And I think that, for me, is the high point of Appleseed Alpha. Story, maybe not so much. Now, Appleseed Alpha is a prequel to Shiro Masamune's Appleseed. Now, I have not read Appleseed, but you have. So tell me a little bit about Appleseed. I mean, we have some of the same characters, right? So the main characters in Appleseed are the main characters here, Duna Newt and how do you pronounce his name? The cyborg? Brarios?
Yes.
Yeah.
I've never been 100% sure because I've never heard them pronounced. But I would like to. I'm glad you mentioned that it's not really a prequel so much. It's an adaptation of this movie, Appleseed Alpha, which is a complete and total retelling of the Appleseed story. In from what I understand, the first Appleseed movie is still a kind of reimagining of the Appleseed story, but in a way that's much closer to Masamune Shirow's manga, whereas this is very, very different. You have some, like you said, the characters are the same. Dune and Nude and Brairos are the kind of stars of Shirow's comic as well, and Olympus, this city of Olympus plays a major role in the original series.
It does.
But other than that, it's cyborgs and stuff like that is also central to the Shirow's comic. But other than that, the story is completely different. The Shirow's comic is just in terms of narrative, it starts out with Dunan and Brairos kind of like in the wilderness, and then they eventually make their way to Olympus, which is this utopian city, and there they join eSWAT. They become the SWAT officers, and from there it's not too dissimilar from Ghost in the Shell, another Shiro comic that we've talked about on the show, which is this kind of police procedural that sees the characters solving crimes and that sort of thing. Whereas in this, as I'm sure you know, is very much not that. It's very much concerned with this post-apocalyptic almost New York, and there are these kind of like so-called aliens that are a prominent thing that are completely absent from the original series. And Olympus is kind of central to Appleseed Alpha, but it's always on the periphery. It doesn't really the kind of like a delegation from Olympus, shall we call them, doesn't really show up until the very, very end as part of like the denouement, and so it's very different. And that's one of the things that was really surprising to me, because I like you, I thought it was a prequel. I had heard it described as a prequel. I think even in some of the press materials, it's described somewhat as a bit of a prequel to Shirow's comic. But yeah, but having read Shirow's comic and having read this comic, they exist in completely different universes. This is like an alternate universe version of Appleseed. Okay. And so I don't really understand why people were describing it as a prequel, because it's really not. It's its own kind of distinct thing.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because in reading some of the, I don't know if it was the publicity material, the marketing material, or just reading about this, like maybe on Amazon or one or two reviews or something, is, I got the sense that this was a prequel. So that's why I was calling it a prequel. But it's interesting to know that this is more of an alternate take on the original Appleseed. Now, I have not read Appleseed, Shirow's. Now, is it Shiro Masamune or Masamune Shiro? I know we've been over this many times before in terms of...
I believe his surname is Shiro.
Okay.
I know we've done volumes and we've talked about some publishers do it this way, some publishers keep the Japanese naming conventions, but I am like 99% sure that his surname is Shiro, and so I tend to just refer to him that way as Shiro. Okay,
so I haven't read the original Shiro series, and one of the reasons is that it's out of print. Mm-hmm. And I'm hoping that Kodansha comes out with new editions of Appleseed, because they did come out. What was it, earlier this year, or is it late last year, with brand new editions of Ghost in the Shell? Yeah. So it'd be great if they could do the same thing with Appleseed, because, Ghost in the Shell was still in print when they came out with these new, really nice hardbound editions. So Appleseed is out of print. It'd be great if they came out with new editions. And they probably will at some point, but just not yet. But I wish I had read the original Appleseed. And my guess is that I would like Shiro's Appleseed more than I did Kuroda's Appleseed Alpha.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you would as well. It features a lot more of it's much more involved in terms of plot. It's much more, the characters are much more developed, and it is over 4 volumes, and so Shiro has much more space, but it's much more Shiro-y in that it is much more concerned with the same sorts of things that Ghost in the Shell is concerned with. Sociological, political, economic, philosophical topics that Appleseed Alpha, which is much more action oriented. Not to say that Shiro's comic is devoid of action, but the action in Appleseed Alpha is a much more central focus. Mm-hmm. So I do think you would enjoy the Shiro manga. But I would like to pick up on something you mentioned about hoping Kodansha comes out with new editions. Actually, around the time that we did the Ghost in the Shell, I wrote this short piece for Paste Magazine about the Ghost in the Shell manga and TV show and anime, and I ended up finding a bit of information about other Shiro comics as well. From what I understand, Dark Horse still owns the rights to a number of Shiro comics. I think they've got Appleseed, Orion, Dominion, and maybe one other one. And I think all of them are available digitally for some reason. They keep them available. I think you can get them through Comixology. If not, you can get them through their website. But it might be because they just don't make money in print. But from what I understand, they do have the rights to them, and they do have they do have editions of them available in some form.
So Appleseed's a Dark Horse title.
Yeah, but they haven't put it in print in. Oh, I think the volumes I got are from like 95 or 96 or something like that. They're quite old. So it's been a while since they have reprinted it. But again, I think it's just because they found a way to make them profitable or something if they have them available to buy digitally, but it's too expensive to print them or something like that.
Yeah.
Because they do have them available, but just not in the format that I would prefer. I prefer print as well.
I just looked it up as you were saying this, and on Comixology, you can get the 4 volumes of Appleseed digitally. Yeah.
It's really weird, and I would like for them to not just I would love for them to reprint Appleseed. But there's like 3 or 4 other titles, like I mentioned, that are available kind of the same way. Mm-hmm. That I would love for them. I would love to buy a print edition of like Orion or Dominion, but they don't have them available. So it's a weird setup. But yeah, you should if you get a chance read the original, because I think you would like it a lot more.
Yeah. Now, to talk about, we've talked about the problems of plot in Appleseed Alpha, but let's talk a little about that to give our readers, I guess, a sense of, what happens in this book. Now, from what I can gather, and please correct me if I'm wrong, and I say from what I can gather because there are a lot of holes and disconnected parts in the plot of Appleseed Alpha, and that's one of the things that kind of frustrated me, especially in the first half. But in a nutshell, what happens is that our main 2 characters, Dunan and Brerios, come to New York City. And New York City is one of this kind of, I guess it's kind of in a futuristic time. So in many ways, it's kind of like Ghost in the Shell. It's one of the, I guess, few urban outposts that is still working. New York's mayor, which is a cyborg, and there is a division in this book throughout between human and cyborg. Both live together, but there are nonetheless this friction between the two. And we do have people who are prejudiced one side or the other. But when Dunan and Brerios come to New York, they're greeted by, pretty soon after getting there, the mayor, who I think his name is Two-Horn. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And he is obsessed with these aliens who have landed on Earth and who are sure to attack New York. And so he is in the process of building up an army that he calls his Rangers, and this is of cyborgs, in order to fight off the aliens. And this is Olympus, right? The aliens, I guess, call their area, their region, Olympus. But the mayor thinks that Olympus, the aliens, are going to attack them. And so when he sees Brarios, who is this, big cyborg, and we should mention that for those who don't know the Appleseed story, Dunan and Brarios have a relationship, right? So we're talking about, interracial, so to speak, relationship between human and cyborg. But when the mayor Two-Horn sees Brarios, he sees a big potential soldier, right, to fight in his Ranger army. And so he courts him, so to speak. In other words, he says he will give him everything he needs. He'll give him the strongest batteries. He'll give him cyborg blood. I don't know exactly what cyborg blood is, but it's mentioned a variety of times throughout the narrative. And eventually Dunan makes her way with other humans to this other region called, the Human Farm, where one of the leaders there, Johnny, and also many of the residents of the Human Farm, are a little prejudiced, so to speak, against cyborgs. And then when Dunan tries to get back into the city to see her companion Brarios, the mayor won't let her, because he wants to give preference to cyborgs, because he truly feels that strong cyborgs are what will save not only the city, but him in his privileged position. I mean, he's quite selfish in that way. Dunan, being clever and smart as she is, eventually makes her way back in. And much of the book, especially the last half, is this tension between human and cyborg. We also see the various, so to speak, aliens of Olympus in the last half of the book. And from what I've gathered, this is the basis of the plot of Appleseed Alpha. Now, I have to say that there are times in the first half of the book that I went back to reread quite a number of times because I felt that I was missing something. In other words, there were, I think, holes in the narrative, but I was trying to fill those in, thinking that maybe going back and rereading would help. But then in the last half of the book, I don't want to say I just gave up on understanding the story. And again, I appreciate the art, but as you pointed out, the story is not the strongest. But I kind of resigned myself to the fact that I'm really not going to understand completely what's going on in terms of the action. So I just read. And if there's something that I didn't understand or couldn't make sense of, I just went with it and continued reading. What was your experience, not looking at the art, but in trying to make sense of the story?
Yeah, I think I had a similar experience to you, that it's, I don't think the world of Appleseed Alpha is I wouldn't consider it well developed. I don't think the characters are well developed. It's very much just a series of incidents. And I think the plot is a little overcomplicated. There's even like a little stinger at the end that like alludes to the past of it's like 4 or 5 pages about Two-Horn's past and like his relationship to the character of Johnny, which you, I think, briefly mentioned a few seconds ago.
A human.
Yeah, and that's so there's a lot of stuff like that seems kind of not, I don't want to say irrelevant, but it's not incorporated into the like overarching story very well, and so it's kind of like ancillary. There's a lot of like stuff that's like ancillary, but there's not enough of it to like really texture or develop this space or this world in a really compelling way. So like you, I just kind of went with it. I don't think I had any difficulty following it so much as like I don't know. I do think it's like, I don't think I had any difficulty understanding it, but I thought it was very superficial. The connections between scenes and events and figures and characters was very superficial. It was like this thing is this thing and it wants to do this thing, and you just kind of, okay, you accept it, you go with it, you don't really, there's really no explanation for why or why that matters or why you should care or what the significance of that or what the consequences of that are. You just know, like, this happens and then this happens and this happens, and you can kind of follow the kind of, okay, this happened and I understand that, and then this happened and I understand that, but you're like, well, what is the relationship between these things is like, it's superficial, I thought.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it, superficial. You also mentioned that there's not much in the way of character development, and I think for the most part I agree with you. One potential exception, and maybe you'll disagree with me about this, I do feel that I knew more about Duna Newt than any other character. In other words, we got to see more of her, and not just her actions, but also how she works, right? Her innards, so to speak, her psychology. I feel like I understand her better than any other character here. Two-Horn, the mayor, he is more two-dimensional than anything. But there's some characters, though, that I'm wondering, why introduce them? I don't see them as performing much of a function. Two in particular. Okay, one is the little girl Dorothy. Remember her? Mm-hmm. Yeah, we see her grandfather, who seems to sleep most of the time that he's on panel, and she befriends Dunan fairly early in the book. Not long after Dunan and Brerios come to New York City, Dunan, I think that they in the place where they're living, meets this girl named Dorothy and her grandfather. And the thing that's distinctive about Dorothy is that she wants to be a cyborg. And in fact, she even threatens a couple of times to cut off her arm so she could get cybernetic appendages. Mm-hmm. And she smokes, and she's a little girl. She's a curious character, but I don't know what purpose she serves. Another character somewhat like this, maybe not as unfunctional, I guess, as Dorothy, is the boy Sakamoto. Mm-hmm. Now, the
bioroid.
Yeah. Now, okay, so I'm not exactly sure what a bioroid is.
Yeah, neither am I. If it's in the original Shiro comic, I don't recall mm-hmm. him explaining it. It's possible. It's been a while since I've read those books, so it's possible that it is incorporated in there, and I just don't recall it. But I think it's supposed to be akin to, like, in Blade Runner, the replicants. Okay. They are synthetic. They are not human, but they look like humans. They act like humans. They think like humans.
But definitely not cyborgs.
Yeah, they bleed. They can die. They are in every way human, except that they are built in some way or produced synthetically rather than biologically or something. That was my kind of vague understanding of that, because he is, there is a scene where he is, and we should mention, this character looks like a child. My understanding was this character is like a child. But there's a scene where he's horned up and he's trying to seduce this, what appears to be an older woman. And he's like, oh, we can have sex. I'm a bioroid. I can't get you pregnant. Don't worry about it. So he seems to be in some ways indistinguishable from, like, he can perform the same biological functions as a human. He has sexual desire like a human might. But he's not human. So the kind of distinction between bioroid and human is very kind of, it's very poorly defined here.
Right. Now, you what you're mentioning, I think, is important. I would have appreciated this character and him being a bioroid, if a bioroid is how you're describing this, if more were done with the if Kuroda did more with the distinction between human and bioroid. In other words, you mentioned Blade Runner, and then that's based on Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. And in both Dick's novel and the film Blade Runner, a lot is made of that distinction, right?
Yeah.
That the replicants are wanting the same kind of liberty and freedom and respect that humans get. Yet their actions kind of undercut a lot of that. In many ways, they're rebels. Nothing's really made of Sakamoto being a bioroid. I mean, the fact that you and I are kind of guessing what a bioroid might be tells you something about how Kuroda's really not filling in those gaps. And I think it's those gaps where things aren't explained, and even the connection between different actions or different moments or events is what bothered me. Again, I really love Kuroda's art. It's just the storytelling seems to be spotty at times. And, I wanted something more to be made of Sakamoto. I thought that it's important. I mean, he's an important character. We see him in a variety of places in the narrative. But I'm not really sure what purpose he serves. Kind of like Dorothy.
No, I agree. There's a number of details and scenes that I think are interesting, but are underdeveloped, and that might be a product of this was an adaptation of a movie that he was selected to do. So it's not like he is wholly responsible for producing this comic, and he can kind of do whatever he wants. So it might be a product of just the constraints of editorial. They needed it to be a certain length or run a certain amount of time or what have you. But I agree that there's a number of things that that's interesting. That's an interesting character. That's an interesting scene. That's an interesting idea. But it's nothing really is done with those things, and so they just kind of exist. There's so much detritus that's kind of floating on the periphery. That's individually each little thing is oh, that's interesting. That's kind of cool. But it never coheres into anything substantive. It's just kind of these little kind of moments and details that are really, really underdeveloped. And so I think in terms of reading the story of Appleseed and reading the world of Appleseed Alpha, we had very similar kind of experiences and opinions. I think for me, and you mentioned that you did enjoy Kuroda's art, but I think for me the difference in our enjoyment levels is just that for me that aesthetic, that just looking at those lines, looking at that sense of motion, that texture was just for me so effective that it just I ended up enjoying it in spite of its numerous shortcomings that I certainly recognize. But it sounds for you that his artwork wasn't quite enough to overcome those deficiencies for you.
Yeah, and maybe if I went back to reread this, I would appreciate it more, because at least I've read through it once, and so I have at least something to hang my narrative hat on, right? Kind of a skeleton of what's going on in terms of the plot that I can maybe make more sense of it if I go back and reread it. I don't know. Now you mentioned that this is an adaptation of the movie Appleseed Alpha. Have you seen the movie?
I haven't. I was kind of aware of it. It came out in 2014, and I was
live action or anime.
It's an anime. It's directed by this guy Shinji Aramaki, who I guess has directed 2 other Appleseed movies as well that this is also disjointed from. But I was kind of aware of it, and actually until I started reading this, I wasn't quite sure whether the manga or the anime came first, but so I kind of knew about it, but I didn't really know that much about it. I didn't know how it was different or from the other movies or from the Shiro comic. So I really, I was aware of it, but I came into this reading blind.
Yeah. Now, are you familiar with anything else that Eo Kuroda has done?
I haven't read anything else of his, but I do know that when he was first announced as the person who would be producing this adaptation, that a number of people seemed really excited because they had a lot of affection for this other series he had done called Sexy Voice and Robo. Mm-hmm. So I haven't gotten a chance to read that series yet, but I kind of like knew about Kuroda, and I knew that series had a pretty good reputation, and it's on my infinite list of things that I should probably get to read. Or try to read it at some point. So even before this, I had intended to read Sexy Voice and Robo, and I still intend to read Sexy Voice and Robo. But I hadn't actually gotten a chance to meaningfully engage in any other work that he had done. Were you familiar with any of works of his before this? Or
No. This is my first time not only reading anything by Kuroda, but even hearing about him. And I ask because, in the back of this book, Shiro writes, it's not called an afterword, but for all practical purposes, it is an afterword. Mm-hmm. And he tells the reader about how he learned that Kuroda had been chosen to do the Appleseed Alpha adaptation, and how he's basically giving him his best wishes of doing so. But in this afterword, that's not called an afterword, he does mention one of Kuroda's previous works. He says at one point, this is what Shiro writes, when my editor told me Kuroda would be handling an adaptation of Appleseed Alpha, I was surprised. You mean the Io Kuroda who did Tengu Party? Really? I asked him twice. So, again, Tengu Party is mentioned, and I didn't know if you had heard of that one.
No, it's I believe I'm looking at just Kuroda's Wikipedia page right now and looking at his list of his works. It might be this, because I had never heard of that before Shiro mentioned it, but there's a title on his bibliography called Dai Nippon Tengu to Ekutoba, which might be what the Japanese name of what Shiro is referring to.
Yeah.
But it's not. It appears to not have been translated into English before, so there's not a lot of information about it.
Okay. Before we leave this, I want to make a comment on something you said a moment ago, and you were talking about the action in the way that Kuroda illustrates action. Mm-hmm. And I think this may get to some of the differences between the other book that we discussed on this episode, Uncomfortably Happy, and Appleseed Alpha. And it reminds me of, I guess, a conversation that my wife Amanda and I have every now and again, and that is we differ in the kind of movies that we enjoy. Mm-hmm. She always says she likes movies where things blow up, where there's a lot of action and there are a lot of explosions and special effects and all of that. Whereas I can appreciate those kind of movies, right, where things blow up and there's a lot of action and all of that. I tend to gravitate toward those films, I tell my wife, that are more talky, that, and again, a great example of this is Woody Allen movies. Mm-hmm. Not everyone, but the vast majority of Woody Allen's films is about relationships and people having conversations and interpersonal relationships, things of that sort. And also, to give you another example, several years ago, I convinced my wife to watch one of my favorite movies from the 1980s, My Dinner with Andre, and I was really playing it up. And if you know My Dinner with Andre, you know that the quote-unquote action is all in the conversation. And the movie is nothing more than a dinner conversation. Mm-hmm. But after the film was over with, my wife, she didn't say this exactly, but she turned to me and she said, in essence, really? And again, that's just the difference between movie styles that we like. It's just different. Coming back to the books that we discussed on this episode, I think that Uncomfortably Happy is analogous to the kind of films that I like to watch, right? Where you don't have a lot of action, you don't have things exploding, you don't have a lot of activity As we pointed out, the things that go on in Uncomfortably Happily are more quotidian, more mundane, everyday, kind of quiet. Whereas in Appleseed Alpha, there's a lot of action. There's a lot of shooting. There's quite a number of explosions. And I think that Kuroda illustrates that really well. There is some action in Hong's Uncomfortably Happy, but the action is usually exaggerated, personal, emotional moments, right? Maybe sometimes physical action, but for the most part, it is more interior emotions being expressed outwardly in this kind of exaggerated, cartoony way. But Appleseed Alpha, again, it's kind of like Appleseed, I guess, and definitely like Ghost in the Shell, more science fiction, futuristic. And so there is a lot of action, activity, explosions, all of that.
Yeah, I think for me, and, thinking about comics, thinking about movies, what have you, I think for me, the works of art that really, they really just stick in my mind that when I think of like movies I think of, or like scenes from movies or images from movies, for me, the works that really resonate with me are works that operate within with an aesthetic that really resonates with me. And sometimes this takes the form of something like, I don't know, a shitty action movie it's kind of dumb and there's no character and the plot is like whatever, but the fight sequences look really great. It's a great looking movie. Or it takes the form of something like Michael Haneke's Cachet, which is a very still movie, which is a very quiet movie, which has no extra diegetic sound. It's very silent. It's very still. And I love Woody Allen movies as well. So for me, it's just about aesthetic, and sometimes that is this kind of like dumb, schlocky pulp stuff, and sometimes it's this very like serious, like rich, high-minded kind of thing. And I think in movies and in prose, there's a lot of stuff like the kind of work that you like that does have that aesthetic that I'm interested in. Like Paul Thomas Anderson movies are not explosion movies. They're not these big Hollywood action movies. They're much more intimate. They're much more small scale. But they resonate with me aesthetically. Thomas Pynchon novels are, I wouldn't call them schlocky, pulpy. They're not airport novels, right? But aesthetically, they really resonate with me. And I think in comics, the problem that I have is that far too often the works that I find really, really beautifully drawn, and the works that I think are much more intimate, much more quotidian stories, there is a stronger division there. Where often the works that I find really beautifully drawn, like Appleseed Alpha, are the kind of works that the story isn't really well developed and the characters aren't really present. But there's sometimes some crossover, like with the work of Jiro Taniguchi, I find really beautifully drawn, and it is much more quotidian and still. But I think, in comics there is that much sharper division between these aesthetics that really keeps me from really getting into work like Uncomfortably Happily, like I know I probably should, because I do recognize its various qualities. Whereas that division is more confused in other media, and I don't have to I don't have to watch nothing but dumb action movies to watch movies I enjoy. I can watch very depressing Michael Haneke movies and enjoy those as well.
Yeah. Nicely put. Well, we discussed on this episode two quite different books, something for someone, whether you like action-packed narrative or more kind of slice-of-life, everyday type of storytelling. We began with Uncomfortably Happy by Yeon-Sik Hong. This came out from Drawn Quarterly. And then after that, Shea and I discussed Io Kuroda's Appleseed Alpha, which was released back in July from Kodansha Comics. So 2 really interesting books. And by the way, we should thank the people in publicity at both Kodansha Comics and Drawn Quarterly, because they kindly provided review copies of both of these books. So thank you. We couldn't do this without the I guess we could do it without the publishers. It would just cost more. But yeah, they do go a long way of helping us, not only with this manga series, but with other comics alternative shows. So yeah, 2 really interesting titles, Uncomfortably Happily and Appleseed Alpha. And you can find great manga like this by going to the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. As Shea mentioned at the top of the show, not only can you find quote-unquote regular comics, comic books, and graphic novels, but they also have a variety of manga you can pre-order, and you can also find already published manga at the sister company In Stock Trades. So dcbservice.com or instocktrades.com, great places to get your manga. And after you do get your titles there, get in touch with me and Shea and let us know what you're reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
You can also email us if you want to get a hold of both of us. You can email us at 2guys@comicsalternative.com. If you want to get in touch with me specifically, you can email me at shay@comicsalternative.com. And Derek, what is your email address?
Interestingly enough, Derek@comicsalternative.com. You can also find us all over social media, such as on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, on Google Play Music, and on Spotify. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, which is, again, comicsalternative.com. So, Shea, a lot of ways for people to get in touch with us, and we would like to hear from you. If you want to email me and Shea and let us know that you missed us dearly, we would appreciate that. Or if you want to email us and say, thank God you were off for a while, wish you had stayed off, we'll take that as well.
Yeah, and we do like hearing from people. We
do. And Shea, it's great to get back into the swing of the manga series. And again, we want to remind our listeners that we're going to be back at the end of the month with yet another manga episode, kind of making up for lost time. This one will be devoted to horror comics for the holiday season. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
We'll see you later this month.